It's a pleasure to be here with all of you this afternoon. I think this is a particularly important lecture and occasion. It's great to welcome Rebecca Henderson from the business school. But before I start, I wanted to say a little bit about the Seraphim Center and where we've been this year and where we're going in the coming 2 years. But I also wanted to thank Professor Homi Bhabha, who's here, and the co-sponsorship of the Mahindra Humanities Center. It's terrific to have a joint intellectual endeavor and conversation. The fact that we immediately agreed at the idea that Rebecca would be a joint speaker speaks to the moment that we live in, I think, where it's fair to say, political economy, I'm going to say it, I think it's fair, it's a bit tough. I don't think political economy has done the job for us that it should have done in the last couple of decades in terms of linking an understanding of macroeconomy, economic structure of the firm, and so forth, to questions of justice, integrity, legitimacy, which is a concept that at the Seraphim Center we talk a lot about, and so forth. It's a hard thing to do, to put together the positive social science involved in understanding business, understanding the economy, normative work that comes out of philosophy and political philosophy, and the political science of organizations, political institutions, and so forth. And I think within the academy, is it too strong to say that that should be one of our core jobs and purposes? And it's one that we have perhaps done less well at over the last few decades. We work in our silos and we haven't put the pieces together. And the Humanities Center, I think, is a place that often focuses on the whole of a conversation, how you find the different parts of an answer to a question, the different kinds of discourse that need to come together in order to address a big topic. And so I think, again, as I said, the fact that we both immediately thought Rebecca Henderson would be a terrific speaker for us to share speaks to the importance of the questions around the economy and justice and human experience and flourishing. At the M&J Seraphim Center for Ethics, we work broadly in the area of ethics and public affairs. We are excited to be celebrating our 30th anniversary this year. You'll hear a lot more about that in a couple of weeks. We have our big party. Come along, May 4th. Did I say that right? Okay, anyway. I can remember May 4th and 5th or May 3rd and 4th. May 4th and 5th, right? Okay, thank you. And we started out as a center that was about ethics and the professions, very specifically the question of within the profession of business, the profession of law, the profession of medicine, what are the ethics that inform professional practice? I'm looking at Howard Gardner, who's here, and has written a lot about the ethics of the professions. And that was an important part of the work of the center to start. But what we're seeing today, I think, in this collaboration between the Ethics Center and, again, Rebecca Henderson from the business school, is the way in which that initial conversation has blossomed into a much bigger intellectual and social undertaking. Again, one that is about how we all live collectively, not merely in our role as professionals, but also in our roles as citizens and human beings in specific relationships of intimacy and the like. And it's a pleasure to be a part of a center that's been able to grow like this over the course of its 30 years. At the center, our practice at the moment is to foreground one theme for a 2-year period, while other themes are also playing in the background. I think of it as a symphony. So for the last 2 years, our theme has been diversity, justice, and democracy. This year, we've had a terrific set of lecturers. We started with Cornel West in the fall, then Jeremy Waldron, Ray Langton, Yuval Levin, Kathleen O'Toole, and tonight, Rebecca. And with this lecture by Rebecca, we're pivoting, in fact, to our theme for the next 2 years, which is political economies and justice. So Rebecca is bringing us to the end of one part of our conversation and helping us launch another. So I want to share with you some of the lecturers for next year. We're going to start in the fall with Danny Roderick, another good Harvard friend. We'll have Martin O'Neill in October, computer scientist and data scientist Tina Eliassi-Rod as part of an effort to talk about artificial intelligence and work and the future of the economy. Ayelet Shachar will be back to issues of migration, which is obviously relevant both to diversity and justice and the global economy. And Philippe van Parijs in the spring, who was here in the early 1990s talking about universal basic income. And of course, he's got a new book out on the subject that is one of his long-standing interests. So it'll be interesting to think about what that conversation was like in the early 1990s, what it's like now. So I invite you all to stay tuned for the conversation next year as we will, as I said, dig into these issues of political economy. But tonight, we have the John and Natty McArthur University professor, one of only a couple dozen university professors at Harvard. Rebecca is a remarkably versatile person, somebody trained in thinking about organizations and management, who at a certain point in her own experience realized that she needed to grapple with the issue of the climate and sustainability and the relationship of the economy and of business to those topics. So just to foreground one recent publication, I would call your attention to an edited volume called Leading Sustainable Change, which came out from Oxford in 2015. And tonight she's going to speak to us on the subject of reimagining capitalism, purpose, and the big problems. Rebecca.
Danielle, thank you very much. I'm honored to be here, especially and delighted that you've taken the trouble to come and listen, particularly on this beautiful afternoon. Let me tell you a little bit about the genesis for this project and what I hope to accomplish this afternoon. About 10 years ago, I was working on the problem of climate change. For 20 years, I'd been a student of innovation. And I was intrigued by what it would take to move the economy to be carbon-free. And I helped to edit a book on the subject called Accelerating Innovation in Energy. And it was quite clear from that early work, and remains quite clear now, that the single thing we could do to really accelerate a transition to carbon-free energy is to impose some kind of tax or price on energy. And many of our colleagues have written on this. And I became obsessed with the question of why business was not advocating for such a tax. Because it was an elegant solution to a difficult and complicated problem. It would head off untold damage. It would create significant markets for renewable energy, and it wouldn't cost that much. And I thought, and this is 10 years ago, why doesn't business just get together and advocate for something so sensible? So what I'm going to talk about today is the result of really 10 years since that time, trying to understand whether and how business might be able to step up to some of the big challenges of our time in productive and useful ways. In particular, what I'm going to do is talk you through the structure of a course that we teach at the Harvard Business School. The name of the course is Reimagining Capitalism, Business and the Big Problems. I apologize for the title. We were trying to fill seats. It's essentially a course about what can business people do? Motivated, concerned business people, what can they do against the big problems? And we focus particularly on two big problems. The first, as you might guess, is environmental degradation, particularly global warming, but also the poisoning of the ocean and the water supply, the destruction of species and topsoil, the poisoning of aquifers. And the second big problem we focus on is that of inequality and social injustice. And we ask, if you're a business person, what can you do? And notice that I frame this deliberately not as what should you do, but what can be done. And in the course of that conversation, I open up the idea that, and this is really the crazy part, that purpose-driven business people might be critical catalysts in driving the system transformation that we need in the next 10 or 20 years. That business people who are motivated by a deep desire to do the right thing and to act with integrity might have an important role to play in shifting the entire system. Now, let me highlight just what a wildly unlikely idea this is. It's unlikely for a number of reasons. The first is that the big problems are, by definition, enormous public goods problems. The way I explain it to the students is we say, you know, there's me right now, and there's us later. And public goods problems are us later problems. And when we think of business, we don't immediately think of it as an us later institution. In fact, there's quite a lot of evidence that business is like really, really good at taking care of me right now. And so why would we think that business was a useful instrument? Secondly, the idea that purpose-driven business should have an important role to play provokes sort of howls of protest on both the right and the left. So the right says, this is simply woolly-headed, muddle-headed nonsense. The purpose of business is business. The social responsibility is to put your head down and make profits. And any muddling about larger issues is just muddling, dangerous distraction, an excuse for crony capitalism or for spending money on your own business. On the left, people tend to think that business cannot be trusted. I have many friends who are dubious about the entire idea that purpose-driven firms might even exist. The idea that business is like in it for themselves is so deeply ingrained and backed up with so much convincing data that the idea that A, purpose-driven firms might exist and B, they might make a difference is like, whoa, at best that's greenwashing, and at worst it's just a rebranding of getting business into government and mucking things up. So we already face a sort of significant threshold. So I'm going to try and talk you through the following idea, which is first, that I completely agree that business is a hugely unlikely solution to the problems that we face. That if you ask me where is our best hope for significant social change, I would turn to Danielle's work or Marshall's and talk about the importance of civic society, of organizing, of the rediscovery of democracy, of well-designed public policy, to my colleague Bill Clark. What are the policies we need to really support a just and sustainable society? That feels to me clearly first best. I got interested in this not only because I was stuck in a business school and heck, what else am I going to do? But because it seemed to me that, alas, the odds of the kind of broad-scale social and political change we would like to see are small, that our governance institutions are under tremendous threat, and that part of that is the result of the way business has been systematically caught up in the intellectual project of denigrating business and its importance. And so it felt to me that this agenda, thinking about purpose-driven business and how they could help the big problems that we face, might be helpful, might be part of a broader coalition. So that's the overall framing. I have broadly 4 ideas I'd like to talk you through. And you should know that this is a 28-session, 1.5-hour course, and I'm going to attempt it in, let's see, 40 minutes. No problem, right? Here we go. 4 ideas. First, I want to present to you a theory of change that is driven by self-interest. That is, I want to make the argument that it is in business's self-interest to fix the big problems, and that one can imagine a sequence of steps that could engage the private sector community in actually taking these problems on and making a difference because it's profitable. First idea. The second idea is that although I myself have talked myself into believing that this is a plausible theory of change, it remains wildly unlikely. I taught for 21 years at MIT, where I was the Eastman Kodak Professor of Management. That was a coincidence, but it turns out to be wildly ironic, because that was the structure of my research. Danielle indicated this. I spent 20 years working with large organizations trying to get them to change. I was with Kodak when they went down. I was with Nokia trying to persuade them that Apple was really something to pay attention to. I am deeply familiar with the barriers to change that exist. So I believe that even if there were, and I'm going to argue there is, a convincing economic case for business to engage with these big problems, that would not be enough. Indeed, I have lots of reason to believe it's not enough. That in fact, one needs to add to that this notion of purpose or values driven. And so the second thing I want to talk about is why might purpose-driven firms be economically viable, and why might they play a critical role in driving this transition? And the third thing I want to talk about is a whole range of legal, normative, practical constraints that people often raise when I talk about this, and suggest that to at least a first approximation, we don't need to worry about them. So that's where I'm going. So let me start with this idea that there is a business case for business to save the world. So let's start with the easiest part of this. Let's start with the collective case. I think we know, and there may perhaps be development economists in the room who know this in spades, that the private sector is much better off when public institutions are functioning well. I read this as the core idea of much work in political science and history over the last 50 years, and following the dramatic collapse of the Russian experiment, a core idea in economics as well. The idea that the free market alone can give you a functioning economy, let alone a healthy and just society, is one that I think has been widely discredited. So we can think of the work of scholars like Daron Acemoglu or Douglas North, talking about the importance of inclusive or open institutions. So in brief, for those of you who don't know this work, the free market, I believe, is one of the glories of modern civilization. A reliance on prices and a decentralized information structure makes things extremely efficient and extremely innovative. So I teach at the business school. I'm in some respects an unabashed capitalist. I love free markets. But we know both from history and from the economics, from the math, that free markets only work their magic when they're properly controlled and constrained. So they have to be genuinely free. Everyone has to be able to play. That means everyone has to be able to play. It's not okay that there are large sections of the population that never get a chance to engage. And prices have to be free and fair. So everything has to be properly priced. So a world in which firms can make money by generating negative externalities, or more colloquially, throwing my carbon dioxide out of the window and my waste into the river, that's not a free market. That's not the free market that we celebrate as the driver in prosperity and freedom. That's exploitation of the commons. And so as we think about the evolution of the Western project and more broadly societies, this need to balance the power and dynamism of the free market with strong institutions is, I believe, quite well established both historically and to some degree statistically, although we can talk about that. So I'm going to suggest that the private sector as a whole has a compelling economic interest in making sure we deal with some of these massive externalities. I could talk in more depth about the likely cost that the destabilization of the climate is likely to impose on global supply chains, on agricultural productivity, on political stability. More colloquially, I usually say, like, it's not in the interest of business to toast the planet. It just isn't. Similarly, it's in no one's business interest to create a significant angry underclass, a group of people who cannot find work and feel shut out and angry. The whole mission of business is to provide jobs and opportunity. If there's a significant blowback against business, and I need only instance the rhetoric around the recent election to give some sense of how potentially dangerous this sort of a reaction can be. And we can look at what's happened to the private sector in Venezuela and what might well happen in Turkey as an example of this dynamic in action. Populism is, in general, not good to what I think of as the free and open market. It's good for some firms. We tend to call those crony capitalism. But for the bulk of people who want to play and participate, it's not good at all. So I'm going to argue there's a collective action. Now, those of you with business backgrounds, and maybe all of you are thinking, well, that's really nice, Rebecca. You know, yeah, there's a collective action, but there's a collective incentive, but that and 25 cents will get you a cup of coffee. You know, to tell a business person that, you know, the private sector has an incentive to respond to education and health problems and rebuild democracy in America and solve global warming is like nice, but I'm busy. And you should know that I'm very sympathetic to that response. I sit on 2 large public boards. I've worked for many, many years inside organizations, and I'm deeply familiar with the fact that real firms face very serious pressures all the time to put their head down right now and make money. They're pressed from the capital market, so they have investors who say, if you don't have the returns I want, I'll find someone else. And they're pressed from the product market. So you have to be making profits, otherwise you don't get to keep playing in the long term. So as I tell my student, we have to find a way through this problem that preserves the profitability of firms. Or, as managers, your first duty is not to crash your firm. You've got to keep making money. That doesn't mean you need to maximize returns every instant at everyone's expense. It does mean that you have to be able to convince the capital markets you know what you're doing and at least survive in the long term in the product markets with competition. So we need a theory of change that allows firms to start making money from this change that's coming. So let me suggest a three-part process. And you should know in the course we do this in a 7-week block, and I'm going to do it in 5 minutes. So if you're interested, ask me. But I want to give you a sense that there might be an economic pathway out there before I start talking about purpose. So here goes. Step 1. Individual firms can make money by addressing the big problems in the context of their own business model. This is sometimes called shared value, sometimes called stakeholder theory. The idea is that thinking about the world in a more holistic way, understanding the needs of multiple stakeholders, might be just a better way to run the firm. And for some firms, this does appear to be the case. Let me give you concrete examples. The most obvious is the opportunities opened up in reducing energy and water use. So a firm like Walmart, which is, as you know, the largest private organization in the world, is deeply invested in reducing energy and water use. I do believe they are purpose-driven. We can have a very interesting conversation about that later. But the economics of what they're doing are very compelling. KKR, that well-known tree-hugging firm, I don't know if any of you know this, but this is kind of a rapacious capitalist on steroids. Every time they buy a new firm, they put in a team to take down water and energy use. So that we believe that you could get as far as 25, 30, 35% decarbonization simply on profitable projects. The opportunity is that large. In the social arena, the business cases tend to be less clear-cut and are most obvious initially in the consumer goods segments. So let's talk about something like Lipton tea. So Lipton is owned by Unilever. They sell 30% of all the branded tea sold in the world. Some years ago, they decided to move into sustainable tea. Why did they do that? They were afraid that they would run out of tea if they didn't. They're sufficiently big that they knew what was happening to the supply chains and wanted to act. But they were also concerned about potential damage to the brand if they did not, and brand advantage if they did move first. So you're seeing some segments of the world, not only in the developed world, but also in the developing, some segments of consumers really starting to care about what firms are doing. If you think about the scandal that engulfed Nike after they were discovered to be using child labor, this would be an example. So firms who are deeply engaged with their brands and the potential for brand damage often have an incentive to try and fix things as long as it's not too expensive. And the good news, or the heartbreaking news, depending on how you think about this, is all of this is not that expensive. We can build a just and sustainable economy. We have the money. It's small at the edges, but you have to be able to get someone to pay for it. So I could go on. I could talk about potential shifts in regulation. That is, if you anticipate that the regulatory regime will shift, it becomes advisable to start to invest in doing new things. The most dramatic recent example of this is the collapse of the market value of the European utilities sector. European utilities in the last 10 years have lost some significant fraction of $1 trillion in market value. It appears to have been caused by the destabilization of pricing driven by the introduction of solar and wind power into the European market. What's so interesting about that is the firms that survived are those that moved into renewables. So we know the 3 utilities whose market values remained relatively high, and they are the 3 that switched. So this case in general is quite powerful, and as I say, I could talk a lot more about it. But you can talk yourself into at least a few firms seeing an individual business model. I don't think, however, that the individual model is near enough to take us where we need to go. Some externalities are genuine externalities. Education in particular is very hard to deal with, or health, or democratic governance, very hard to deal with as an individual firm. So one reason these firms moving into these individual models is potentially so interesting is they rapidly come up against their limits. So I talked about the case of Nike, whose immediate response to the scandal around child labor was to say, well, we'll fix our own supply chain. And it became very clear very quickly that you couldn't fix your own supply chain because it was everyone's supply chain. Similarly, Unilever, which moved very early to invest in sustainable palm oil, worked out pretty quickly that no, we have to have lots of friends, otherwise there's no way we can make this work. Partly that's driven by the need to make these costs what one might call pre-competitive. So let me put this in kind of simple terms. I want to pay my workforce more, but if I pay them more and nobody else does, they will put me out of business. So, big idea, why don't we all pay our workers more? Why don't we all stop imposing forced overtime and harassing the women and doing these horrible things that are happening in the supply chain? If we can all do it, we won't lose our competitive edge and we will protect ourselves from significant brand and regulatory risk. So what you're seeing is in a number of industries the emergence of what's called self-regulation. Coalitions of firms saying, okay, I won't pay off the locals if you don't pay off the locals. I won't throw my stuff into the stream if you don't throw your stuff into the stream. And that's accompanied with, of course you need this, metrics, audits, and sanctions. Because what we know about self-regulation of that type is it's not very stable. The temptation to defect is quite strong. And indeed, it's that temptation to defect and the fact that it's hard to pull together these coalitions that then takes us to the third step in the theory of change, which is you're working on this. In the case of palm oil, they have every major Western consumer goods company signed up to buy sustainable palm oil. So, for example, I was with the strategic planning manager for Pepsi, and I said, so tell me about sustainable palm oil. I see you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars. He said, yeah, brand damage. You know, the Pepsi brand, unbelievably valuable, gotta go to sustainable, the risk is too high. If Coke does it too, then I'm on much better ground. The trouble is, even with all the Western consumer goods companies, you only have 60% of the industry. You still have a lot of trouble on the ground. It would be really nice if the Indonesian government started thinking about this. In the case of labor supply, a lot of the Western firms have come to believe that if the locals would start enforcing the labor laws, and the mining companies have come to believe if the police behaved well and we had enforcement of the local human rights laws, you know, everything would be better. And so they discover on the ground and in real time that, whoa, institutions are not so bad. What's interesting is one can look at the recent election and the response of the private sector and say, whoa, we're even seeing that, you know, not in the developing world, we're seeing some business leaders in this country going like, whoa, you know, government regulation is really helpful. You know, a well-working democracy, really, really helpful. So that gets you to all kinds of collective action and engagement. So that's my economic theory of change. So we start out doing ourselves, we discover we need to work with our competitors, we work with our competitors, we discover that, whoops, having government in the mix and NGOs in the mix would be really good, and we rediscover the healthy society and start working on it. So that sounds good, I hope, maybe a little bit good. The difficulty with it is the one that I raised with you, which is nice theory, but like, I don't really believe it. I mean, it sounds like a lot of work and a lot could go wrong, and you know, why should firms take that kind of risk? And that's what brings me to this idea that purpose-driven firms might be critical catalysts in this process. So what is a purpose-driven firm? I define a purpose-driven firm as a firm that's willing to spend real money in public in pursuit of a goal that is not profit maximization. So for me, you're not authentic unless you credibly commit resources to doing the right thing, at least from time to time. For me, that's the definition. Now, you might say, well, how does a firm like that survive, right? If it goes out of its way to pay its workers more, or if it goes out of its way not to employ child labor, and it says that's because we're purpose-driven, surely that invites the very competitive problems I've been talking about. And here I want to briefly orient you to a very exciting stream of research that's been happening in multiple fields over the last 5 to 10 years. You should know that scholars in organizational behavior and organization theory have believed for many years that so-called high commitment or high road or high integrity firms are likely to be significantly more productive and creative in many situations than their more conventional rivals. So my suggesting to you that no, this really might be the case is not a new idea for someone who's spent a lot of time in organizations. What's new, I think, and this reflects my own background in economics and engineering, is that we've been able to both look at the microdynamics of this in the lab, in psychology and behavioral economics, and we now have macro-level data which is consistent with this story. So let me alert you to two particular pieces of data that I think are fascinating in this context. The first comes out of work that has been conducted in the area of productivity based at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a wide variety of universities, trying to understand what makes some firms more productive than others. We have suspected for a long time that some firms are better managed than others. When you look at the data, firms in the top decile of productivity are on average in every major industry where we have good data, as much, on average, about twice as productive as firms in the bottom decile. That's with the same capital, the same labor, or controls for capital, controls for labor, controls for prices, controls for product mix. I spent 20 years in conference rooms where people refused to believe this result. For a long time, we thought we just didn't have the right data. It was some kind of unmeasurable effect. Let's control for management quality, whether they went to MIT or Harvard. I'm not making it up. That's a real study. What must be driving this? And we have, in some ways, reluctantly, but also excitedly come to believe that these differences in productivity are at the very least tightly correlated with differences in the adoption of so-called managerial practices. Again, I could go into more depth here, but the intuition is that we pretty much know there's a better way to manage the firm. It involves high trust, work groups, communication, high integrity, treating people with respect, doing continuous improvement. Again, I'm telling you nothing new. This is what Toyota brought to the Western world. What we have now is data from thousands of firms across every major nation showing that the correlation between these practices and productivity is very robust. This is work by John Van Reenen and Nick Bloom and my own colleague Rafaela Sedan. It's brilliant work, and I would recommend you to it if you're interested. But we're now sure that this is real. And now the question is, well, if it's that easy, why doesn't everyone adopt these practices? The first level response is, well, it must be some difference in competition. The firms that are holding back are those that are in uncompetitive markets and they're just hanging out and having fun. Why bother to do these new practices? That turns out to explain a very small proportion of the variance. The second idea was, well, maybe it's information. Maybe people just don't know these practices are good. And that does indeed appear to explain an important amount of the variance in the less developed markets. So if you look at the distribution of managerial practices in, say, India or China, there's a huge kind of lower tail of people that to us look as though they have just no idea what they're doing. And that's probably information diffusion. But what's puzzling is even after you control for that, you still see very slow diffusion of these practices. And I myself, for example, have written on General Motors and why they knew that Toyota was doing things better years ago, and it took them 25 years to shift. And this is despite more than 300 books written about what Toyota was doing and at least 4,000 academic articles. So what the heck is going on? So my own personal explanation, and this is joint work with my colleague Bob Gibbons at MIT and the subject of my sort of pointy-headed peer-reviewed research, is that what's going on is some firms can build what economists call relational contracts and what everybody else calls trust. That is, it's one thing for General Motors to turn to its employees and say, I read this paper. It says that if I treat you with trust and respect and we form collaborative teams that do joint learning, we'll both be richer. What do you say? And in essence, my work with Bob is that making that speech is not sufficient to persuade the American auto workers that General Motors means what it says. And indeed, when you look at General Motors' history, you see this pattern of they say it, it takes them about 6 months to change their mind, everybody decides, okay, they are bastards, back to square one, and you can't adopt the practices. So our belief is that this variation in diffusion is importantly driven by variation in the ability to build relational contracts. And I believe that that is correlated with the embrace of purpose or integrity. That managers who display a strong sense of mission to something other than their personal wealth maximization are much better positioned to build these kinds of contracts, and that these contracts are fundamental to high performance. I also believe they're fundamental to driving innovation. Again, this is my academic work over many years, but I've come to believe that the single thing that enables firms to go through these kinds of discontinuous or disruptive transitions is the belief that they want to be emotionally committed to doing things differently. Because if you're driven merely by profits, you're not going to do it. I've worked with hundreds of firms trying to move through these transitions. There are, of course, lots of things we could talk about in the way you do strategy and the way you structure your organization. But without the ability to handle uncertainty, without the ability to trust each other, without the ability to take risks and see the bigger system, it's very hard to make these transitions. And purpose-driven firms are much better positioned to make these transitions. So as I said, I think there's good reason to believe that purpose-driven firms in some circumstances are both more productive and more innovative than their more conventional rivals. This makes them incredibly important in thinking about the transition we face. Because I think, and once Eastman Kodak professor of management, you can't get it out of me, I think what we're facing is the analog of the problem that Kodak faced. They were focused on analog photography, and they saw digital coming, and they made a lot of technical investments, but they didn't really shift. Because, and here's what everyone says, it's not going to happen. My customers don't care about it. I can't make any money. And then if you get them through all of that, okay, it is happening. Okay, my customers do want it. All right, there might be money. They say, I'm very busy. I have the wrong capabilities. It's not urgent, go away. So in essence, I think of this as good news. That is all the blowback we're facing now, like it can't happen, you guys are crazy, it can't be done. It's just normal. It's just what happens at any major transition. And the role of the purpose-driven firms is to power through that and demonstrate what's on the other side, which just as in the case of Nokia and Kodak was something really exciting. And so I think purpose-driven firms have a really important role to play. I want to make sure I leave lots of time for questions. So let me say just a couple more things. So first, I've suggested that purpose-driven firms may be important because they'll be the first to pick up this business model. Let me suggest there are two other reasons that purpose-driven firms might be really critical. The second is because, as I hope my theory of change suggested, the ability to cooperate is going to be central. So many of these business cases rely on all the firms getting together and saying, okay, I won't screw my workforce if you don't screw your workforce. I will contribute to the health of the local community if you contribute to the health of the local community. What do we know about humans and their ability to cooperate? I think we know, and here I feel really nervous saying this because my guess is there are people in this room who know much more about this than I do. I think we know that purpose-driven humans who are committed to something greater than their own personal gain are much more likely to enter into cooperative agreements and are much more likely to be trusted when they do so. So a real example from business on this front is the case of Minneapolis. Is there anyone here from Minneapolis? No? So it's a very interesting city. For many years, it was full of Scandinavians and very successful corporations. It has one of the highest concentrations of Fortune 500 companies of any city. It's also striking because the business community is deeply engaged in the local community. They invest heavily in, one of their most famous projects is investing heavily in early moves in early childhood education. demonstrating the kind of interventions that would really improve the well-being of the citizenry. They're deeply engaged in issues of diversity. Minneapolis is no longer mostly Scandinavians. Deeply engaged with a range of attempts to improve the quality of the workforce. Well, why are they doing this? When you talk to them, they'll give you the business case. In public, every business person has to be able to give you a business case for reasons we could talk about, but trust me. And so they will tell you, we're headquartered here, this is our home, we have to be able to recruit world-class talent, the weather is not a huge draw, nor are the mountains, so we have to have a really good quality of life, so here's the business case. Well, notice if you're an MBA, you should be immediately suspicious because yes, it's a business case, but like it's really collective and really long-term and you can't be serious. So when you push below that, what you get is a dense social network embedded in social ties and a strong sense of this is the way senior management behaves in this city. And there's this interesting mix of social sanctioning and of celebration of people who act in the way that generates the entire community, that supports the whole community. When you look at how the firms in the Consumer Goods Forum were able to commit to sustainable palm oil, one of the interesting things is there are only 12 of them, and they all know each other, and they all talk together. And when you get them alone, they say, Rebecca, what is happening in the world is awful. We have to do something. So there's this very interesting dynamic where in public, I'm maximizing shareholder returns and I'm the consummate business person, and to embrace the notion of purpose or values or meaning is like really squishy and mildly female, which is another issue we could talk about. Real men don't talk about purpose. But when you get them over a beer, they'll say, you know, we're burning the planet and cutting down all the trees, and look what's happening to our society, we've got to do something. And in small groups, that commitment can result, I believe, in real action. Now, my model is not that purpose-driven firms are throwing money out the window. The model that's in my head is every business person faces choices all the time about where to invest resources. You can take the low road or you can take the high road. And of course, if the high road is going to bankrupt you or be ridiculous, you're not going to do it. But often, the choices are at the margin. Do I go low road and make it right now? But if I go high road, then I might make more money in the long term and we'll cooperate and it'll be good. And for me, the role of purpose is all about moving firms towards high road. When those moments of choice come, I go the right way, and in doing that, bring others with me. So that's the second reason I think purpose is so important. The third is because the risk of crony capitalism is real here. 2 years ago, when I presented this material to one of our colleagues on the faculty, whose name you would know, he said, that's very interesting, Rebecca. You must be either stupid or corrupt. He didn't use quite those terms, but it was close enough. It was an unvarnished response. So stupid, because there is no business case, so I've really worked on that one. And corrupt, because to encourage firms to act in this way is to legitimate and sanction wholesale greenwashing and the engagement of firms with government. And wait, we're not so sure we want that. And indeed, when I teach the Minneapolis case to my students, they're like, whoa, are you telling me that the business people are in there with the Democratic representatives, and you're telling me they're shaping the educational system, and you're telling me they're shaping the income policies? Like, am I excited about that? Is that good? And that's a real question. And so I think the third reason conversation about purpose and values might be really important is the possibility for this to degenerate into the worst kind of crony capitalism is very real. And so I believe that in the long term, we need to shift what we might call the social imaginary or the normative matrix in which business is embedded, so that managers can no longer say, it is my moral duty to maximize shareholder value, and I have no moral duty to do anything else. That in adopting that rhetoric, we have legitimized the worst kind of destructive behavior, not on the part of many firms, but on the part of enough that everybody else feels pulled in that direction. So the other reason to really encourage and support this conversation about purpose is to try and change the framing of business and to enable, of course, those movements in civil society and in democracy that are so critical to really driving the shift. Because, of course, I do not believe that purpose-driven firms alone can save the world. That would be a crazy claim. I claim that they might be important allies. That if we see more firms acting in this way, it will legitimate acting in this way. It will encourage consumers to demand products and services that are properly produced. It will encourage regulators to enact the smart and well-designed policies that will persuade everyone to act well, because they will have seen that that doesn't destroy economies or put firms out of business. So that what we're talking about here is a change in the entire system, of which perhaps some segment of the business community may play an important role. I have just a few minutes left before I want to break for questions, so let me touch on some caveats or issues that might be in your mind, but of course we'll have time to talk about them. The first might be whether what I have described is legal. Many business people believe that their fiduciary duty is to maximize shareholder value right now, and anything else is illegal. I'd be happy to send you my written work on this point or to refer you to the lawyers, but this is in fact an incorrect belief. Your fiduciary duty, as in the Anglo-American system, is of care, candor, and loyalty. It is to the health of the organization. But as long as you don't take shareholder money and shovel it out the window and announce that's what you're doing, as long as you can make a plausible case that what you're doing will contribute to the health and well-being of the firm, you're on fine legal ground. You're covered by what's technically called the business judgment rule. You, of course, still have to deal with the capital markets and with the product markets. I've talked about why I think this might be competitive. Let me talk for a moment about the capital markets. And here I'm summarizing very inadequately many years of research by my colleague George Seraphim, with whom I teach Reimagining Capitalism and from whom I've learned an enormous amount. His belief is that the financial sector, paradoxically, might be the sector that could internalize the big externality. Namely, that if we toast the planet and destroy our institutions, it won't be good for business. That a significant fraction of the financial sector has obligations extending 30, 40, and 50 years in advance. And they are large enough that they have to, what the business people call, hold the portfolio. That is, you can't just pick up a few firms that you think will do well. You've got to hold the whole thing because, for example, in the case of an entity like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, you are 1.5% of the capital markets. Just think about that. The Norwegians own 1 in 100 of every equity. And they have to have that money available 30, 40, 50 years in advance. They want to address global warming. They want to address institutional health. And so possibly we might see these big long-term capital holders beginning to press firms to focus on the long term. That coincides with a really exciting move in the way firms measure themselves and report their metrics. We're beginning to see increasing evidence that firms that act against so-called ESG, environmental, social, and governance metrics, outperform those that do not. This result is very controversial because causality is hard to untangle. But in my own mind, the result is getting stronger and stronger. My most exciting recent paper in this area is by my colleague George Seraphim. And he, using very good data derived from 500,000 employee records, and deriving a really good measure of purpose, that is not just what the CEO says, but whether people on the shop floor really believe this firm is purpose-driven. He has that measure, and he runs it against financial performance. And what he finds is nothing. That is, simply embracing purpose is not correlated with superior performance. That's consistent with a lot of work that suggests it doesn't harm you, but it doesn't advantage you. But then he does the following exciting thing. He divides the sample into two. Half are those firms which are high purpose, but also feel like a family, where people really enjoy coming to work and have very high levels of camaraderie. And the other is we're high purpose, but we have very clearly defined goals and we've designed them together. And one of those groups way outperforms the other. Can you guess which it is? So how many of you think it's feel like a family camaraderie? That's what drives financial returns. And how many people think it's clear goals, let's really drive the business? Well, you're right. It's clear goals, let's really drive the business. This is consistent with a long stream of research that suggests employee happiness is not, alas, correlated with productivity or profitability. But if you are purpose-driven and you are totally focused on the bottom line and you're running the business like you ought to, then whoa, we see supernormal performance. And we're seeing more and more financial people saying, well, maybe these ESG metrics give us much more data about what's going on inside the firm. Maybe if we could standardize these metrics so we knew what they meant, then we could evaluate firms that are doing well on this dimension and we could channel our capital to them. This is still in an early stage, but about a third of investors claim to be using these metrics. And George says, and this is his thing, that the best people wouldn't dream of investing without them. That this is clearly what's going to be driving investment, at least a serious input to investment going forward. So that's, is it legal? Can you survive? Will the capital markets let you do it? Last but not least, no, I have two more ideas, I'm sorry. Last, not quite last, this question of is it moral? Now, I suspect in this room this may seem a little weird. That is, is it morally weird if a firm says, I care about environmental issues and the labor force, are they, is that morally okay? Many people would say, well, of course it's morally okay. What do you mean? What are you going to do? Just make a lot of money while the planet burns? That's like not moral. But the issue here is some managers believe that doing anything other than maximizing shareholder value is to disown the fundamental normative commitments of capitalism. That the social responsibilities of firms really is to maximize profits. But as I have argued in work with Karthik Ramana, who's now at Oxford, we believe this is a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between the normative basis of capitalism and the moral duty of managers. That, as I suggested at the beginning, the moral commitments of managers should be to a really free and fair market. That is, that the language that's so often used to talk about why profit maximization and the free market is so important, namely that it maximizes prosperity and freedom, is contingent on markets being properly controlled and properly policed, and on public goods being really in place. So a market, if you make money, as I said, through throwing carbon dioxide out the window, abusing your workforce, and lobbying for lower taxes when you know those taxes are necessary to the health of the society, you are not meeting your normative duty as a capitalist. Now, of course, we could have a conversation about alternative moral frames, but even just to take very seriously the espoused values of the business leaders is to say, you have a moral responsibility to think about these issues. Last but not least, let me talk about the issue of instrumentality. So some of you in listening may have thought, well, Rebecca, this is very interesting. But you've basically made a case that moral values are instrumentally important. That you should embrace purpose because that will get you through this next transition and raise your profits and improve the longevity of the private sector. And if your embrace of purpose is instrumental, is it really moral? Like, how do we think about that? And in answering that question, let me go even further out on the ice, because I feel myself dancing on a lot of thin ice as it is, and suggest that I think this separation between instrumentality and what it might mean to be genuinely moved by purpose is archaic, in the sense that it makes sense conceptually, but in the level of how people really live and breathe, I think modern psychology suggests that this division is not very useful. That moral reasoning is very real. Myself, I like Haidt's metaphor of the elephant and the rider. This idea that we're all governed by two systems, one emotional and intuitive, which is extremely powerful and does most of our automatic processing. And then we have a kind of reflective part of our minds that stops and reasons. And he suggests, and this is others have said the same, that the elephant has very strong moral intuitions. So as I think about what it means to be a purpose-driven leader, I think about the rider, the conscious mind, sitting up there on top of the elephant, talking about, yes, I have a business case, and this is really good, and here's the net present value. And underneath, the elephant is going, I don't care. This is the right thing to do. We've got to make it happen. And that one sign of an integrated person is to be able to hold both of those things in tension. And indeed, my students now talk about I'm still teaching, when we're doing a case, and I'll say, well, why do you think management responded this way? And one of my students said recently, I think their elephant got kicked in the face. And so we had this elaborate business rationale, which is a good business rationale, don't get me wrong. But as I said, you can pretty much justify almost anything. I mean, I don't know when we teach our MBAs, but 2 years out, they know how to give you an MPV for whatever you want to do. I mean, that's okay to do, as long as it's not too out of line. What's important is that there is a significant fraction, I believe, of the ruling elite, the ruling business elite, who believes that what's happening now is morally bankrupt and must be responded to. And I believe that if we can encourage that, speak to it, support it, that may play a major role in driving change. Yes, it will have instrumental benefits, but that's the nature of the case. If you're a business leader, you have to think about instrumentality. But I think the purpose is central. So, on that note, let me close. Thank you very much.
Terrific, thank you. And I'm sure for many people that was probably the first encouraging thing we've heard in a little while. Arthur?
Thank you so much for that, Rebecca. Thank you. So you began your talk by saying that there's a first best solution, and the first best solution is that our actual institutions should be doing this. And in the face of that failure, what can business do? But of course, as you very well know, it's not as if business is neutral in this respect. Business spends a lot of money, in one sense, on lobbying and on campaign contributions. I say a lot of money. With respect to an individual voter, it's obscenely large. With respect to net corporate profits, it's rounding error. And in fact, one of the puzzles is, why does industry not actually spend more on politics rather than less? So it's already the case that businesses are not neutral with respect to the undermining of our institutions. Yes, I'm sure some businesses actually lobby for good things, but most businesses lobby for their own particular interests, which may be a good thing only accidentally, right? So it's already the case that there's an extremely effective way to fix our institutions. It's to take the money that you're currently spending on contributions and lobbying and make that purpose-driven. And as I said, that's rounding error. We have 535 members of Congress. You have 500 Fortune 500 companies. So you take the 100 and they'd get the Senate, have to spend maybe $10 billion each, and then there are other 400 to spend $1 million each, and they each buy themselves representative in Congress. And if all these people are purpose-driven to the degree of $1 to $10 million, which, as I said, is pocket change, then overnight we can change our institutions. Now, that isn't happening. If anything is happening, it's in the negative direction, not the positive direction. So again, it's not that I'm arguing for more corporate money in politics, but if you're asking for how it is that corporate America can actually make our institutions better, there's a very, very clear path. And right now, they're using that clear path negatively rather than positively. So why do you really think that your solution is going to work when there's a cheaper, easier, much more effective solution that they're actually working against rather than for?
So let me both agree and disagree with you. Let me agree in the following sense, that there are many ways in which the corporate sector is engaging with the political process in negative ways. I actually think that the amount of money spent on lobbying is a very small fraction of what's going on. You should know I sit on the board of a major biopharmaceutical firm that lobbies extensively and have worked with other firms. And the money actually spent in campaign contribution or in paying the lobbyists is only a small portion of what's going on in the relationship between business and government. Even more important is the provision of information and trying to ensure that that information is provided in the public good. So you're saying reasonably enough, like you've got this whole elaborate thing going here, Rebecca, and here we've got this really bad stuff, and why don't you start with the really bad stuff? So the reason I don't start with the really bad stuff is it's really hard, okay? So it's not that there are no firms who are not trying to engage with the government in positive ways. The most visible example would be those firms that have been arguing for a carbon tax or a carbon price. There are also firms trying to engage around workforce policies and other positive signs. But here's the thought that's in my head, which may well be incorrect. And you should know, when I teach my students, I tell them, I don't think this is a done deal. I don't think this is like a sure thing. This is definitely going to happen. It's going to save the world. I'm not even sure it's plausible. I think it's possible. So here's what's in my head. We try and split the elite so that some fraction of the business establishment starts acting and talking in ways that are authentically purpose-driven. And as they do that, it becomes very clear that the health of the institution makes a big difference. And then you double back and you say, and how am I engaging in the political process? How am I engaging in lobbying? In many ways, if I were to achieve with this agenda some embarrassment or shame in some firms about acting badly with respect to institutions, I would say that was a huge success, okay? So in a sense, that's my goal. That's what I'm talking about when I say we have to shift the conversation and shift the normative matrix. The problem that we have right now is some managers believe that lobbying to fix the rules in their own interest is consistent with their fiduciary duty and is a moral imperative. That's intellectually wrong, morally wrong, economically disastrous. That's what we got to go after. And so that's my work with Karthik and trying to be very clear about when lobbying is appropriate and when not, and how you should think about it as a firm, and how you should control and constrain your lobbying behaviors. But it is hard because, as you know, the returns to lobbying on your own behalf are very, very high. Great question.
Oh, me. Oh, sorry, there's a mic coming so everybody can hear you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And I think perhaps one of the most radical things you did today was to start with the Leninist question, what is to be done? I haven't heard Lenin invoked in a long time. You did it. Well, I think that's great. But let me just put three short things to you. I very much go along with what you've said as forms of good procedure and good practice. And I don't think that good procedure and good practice is simply instrumental. It's about principle and implementation together. And I think that's extraordinarily important. But I couldn't work out what you put on the other side of profit maximization, other than a just society, a good society. I couldn't, do a bit better, incrementality, all of which is excellent. But I needed something more. I needed, here we know what profit maximization is about, we know what, but for the purpose-driven firm, what is the moral ratio? Are you, what is it to look after your workforce better? Of course, absolutely agree with you. But I needed some kind of matrix, some kind of ethical, some set of even tentative ethical principles that I could then attach.
Yes.
Can I add a footnote to that, Rebecca? Because my question was a version of
Please,
that question, so we might as well go ahead and have them both on the table at the same time. So you had many formulations throughout your talk that were about shifting from profit maximization to X, and every time you gave us the X, it was a list of 3 things. This is sort of Tahomi's point. Or you gave us the example that people ask you, is shifting away from profit maximization illegal? And you say, no, your fiduciary duty is to care, loyalty, candor, loyalty, right, the health of the organization. So the point is, it's a multiple criteria judgment as opposed to a unitary value, profit, which is maximized. The other point, I think, in Homie's question is that maximization is easily mathematized. And so the entire academic structure of thinking about the economy and business depends at the moment on the easy mathematization of that concept. Whereas judgment about competing criteria and values, we simply don't have mathematization of that, to the best of my understanding. And you could put it in the normative terms that Homie did. What's the doing the right thing? That's the unitary package. Good judgment, that's the unitary package. There's a history, you can go back to sort of Aristotle, et cetera, and provide ways of accounting for that, but it's never, or Sen's capabilities theory, to sense is a version of that. None of that line of thinking has ever been mathematized.
Yeah, can I just finish? In fact, I wrote capabilities here, so we're very much on the same track. Thank you very much for that. So I just have two issues here. One, to continue from that, that's a very useful way of unpacking in a different way what I was saying. So the other issue I want to ask you about is, how does this change the culture of business schools? The sort of thing you're arguing about. You're talking about the institutions of capital and business practices. But what about the pedagogical change in business schools? Think in the way in which you think. What would that do at that point? My final question is just that these private-public partnerships, the way I've seen them work extremely well, have been in the cultural sector. And I just thought that might be something else. But, pick and choose. This is a Chinese menu. But thank you.
So between the two of you, you're raising a number of deep and profound questions, most of which I am deliberately avoiding. Okay? So let me give you a sense of what I am avoiding. I am trying to rigorously avoid any discussion of a desired end state. So what is to be done? This could have been a talk about what a reimagined capitalism looks like. That is, where is it we're trying to get? When pressed in private, I will say something like Denmark, probably only globally. Right? So I see a private sector embedded in a strong society with strong labor representation and strong civil society, united and continually it's making trade-offs on these dimensions. And the reason I mention that is because what I am advancing is at heart a process. That is, I'm suggesting business start acting in this way because I think it will have good effects, rather than trying to design an end state. You asked me quite correctly, well, how much good are firms supposed to do, and how could I tell if they were doing enough? And if we're leaving profit maximization behind, what are we replacing it by? So I'm afraid I put a very important rabbit into a hat in my third paragraph. The important rabbit was, I said, it is in the private sector's economic interest to build a strong society. So I do not, in fact, advocate moving away from shareholder value maximization or from profit maximization in the long term and forever. I'm recommending two things. One, that there's a lot more wiggle room in that concept than most managers think, that you can plausibly maximize profits, or at least make decent profits over the long run, and pay attention to some of these ethical issues. And that indeed, if we all did that, we would all be better off. So I'm arguing first about time frame. The second
that was a
point,
shift. Maximization and decent are not decent profits aren't the same concept.
I know you were listening. And there's a kind of deep issue in here about timeframes and maximization that is actually central to the argument, but is deliberately slippery. But let me keep going just two more places, and then I'll stop, because this is a great question. As we think about an end state, I said purpose firms could be catalytic in driving change, and this relates to the question about lobbying. I do not believe in my wildest dreams that the business community will wake up and go like, oh, we've been doing this wrong, we need ethical values, we should support institutions. I mean, like, no way. I'm hoping that 20 to 25, 30% of the business community starts to act in this way, and that empowers both civil society consumers and regulators in ways that make them put in place the kind of legislation and controls we need. Because when you look historically, when you send your RA out to, okay, RA, tell me those times that business has changed institutions for the better. You know, the first thing he comes back with is, Rebecca, I don't think it's ever actually happened. You know, let's look about the Dutch East India Company in the Spice Islands. You know, they killed the entire native population and replaced them with slaves. They weren't maximizing profits, but, you know, they kind of look bad anyway. It turns out when you start looking, that what really holds business to behaving well is, of course, strong countervailing pressure. So usually from strong countervailing pressure, usually from labor, but often from also from other institutions. And when you look at this historically, and we think you can see elements of it in the European revolutions, in the French and English revolutions, also in Chile and Brazil, in Mauritius, and in Japan. What you see is some segment of the elite that says, you know, this is not working. Let's redo this. And they join forces with other elements of the society. And so at root, this is kind of an uneasy mix of moral values, instrumentality. I do not have for you a well worked out process. In essence, what I'm suggesting is we need to unleash those elephants, which are by definition not well reasoned and are dangerous, right? We know that some moral intuitions are really, really dangerous. To your last point, though, which is a nice, easy softball question, the implications for managerial pedagogy. So we teach a course at the business school called Leadership and Corporate Accountability, which is largely about individual ethics. We are in the midst of very exciting conversation about evolving that first year course to address precisely these issues and to bring a bunch of the material from Reimagining Capitalism into the required curriculum of the MBA course. We believe that's important not only because it might help shape our own graduates, but because Harvard is the largest single source of teaching materials for every business school in the world. And so one of our hopes is to use the power and reach of the school to highlight the importance of thinking about shareholder value maximization in these more nuanced ways. Notice I'm not suggesting throwing it out the window. I'm suggesting thinking about it in much more nuanced and subtle ways.
Thank you very much.
So maybe you can fold that into the next question too, if that's all right.
my best,
Melissa, let's
yes.
come up front, Susan, if that's okay, to Melissa. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for
Microphone's coming.
oh,
you go.
thanks. Thanks for a very uplifting lecture. So your response to the last question was great in helping me to think through what I wanted to ask you, because it seems your theory of social change that you're trying to advance through this idea of the purpose-driven firm seems to suggest that there may be a kind of tipping point, that if you split the elite, you get 25-30% of the elite to go along with your arguments, that will generate a process of a kind of snowball.
A self-reinforcing process, yes.
Right. But my question is, when does that bump up against the structural realities of the proportion of profits that are actually generated through being bad actors by socializing externalities? And surely that proportion varies across sectors. And so you're going to be more capable of persuading elites in the sectors where actually they're not getting that much profit from socializing externalities to adopt the purpose-driven approach. They may actually gain from that. But if we're looking at the global economy, you know, what proportion of global profits actually depend upon predatory, extractive, externalizing activities?
So this is a great question, and it goes to the sort of common response from many of my colleagues in history or sociology or even economic development, which is, oh, come on, Rebecca, you've got to be kidding. You know, there's so much money in behaving badly. How are we ever going to shift these guys? And they have all this money, and they're using it to corrupt the political system. You know, so we are toast. So, first response, we are toast. We have a really, really serious problem because the generation of profits through the degradation of institutions and the destruction of the public goods is an enormous profit opportunity that's being heartily embraced by a number of powerful firms. And they rotate that money back into activities that distort the institutions. I mean, I get that in spades. Probably know a little bit more about it than perhaps many people in this room. So here is the wild and crazy idea. And you should know that I do not have a background in history or political economy, right? I've been trying to get up that learning curve really fast. But my expertise is in innovation and how organizations change. And so I'm making the following conjecture or hypothesis. What I've seen in the innovation space is people fight like crazy until it's obvious that the new way is much better. And that usually takes about 20 to 25% of the industry to shift, and then everyone else is scrambling to catch up because there are self-reinforcing processes at work. Now, it's easy to say, well, that might be true in, say, the adoption of the smartphone, but why would it be true in the adoption of good institutions? My reading that I've done leads me to believe that there are moments when the extractive regime becomes so obviously extractive and so obviously dysfunctional that the society rearranges. Sometimes that's incremental, sometimes it's violent. I believe we may possibly be at such a moment. And my, what evidence do I have for you? So I'll give you my little piece of evidence, which is that Reimagining Capitalism is the fastest growing elective at the Harvard Business School. And this is not like mainstream business stuff. We have nearly 300 students enrolled. We could have 400 if we could offer another section. The idea that we might roll this into the required curriculum is like not a crazy idea. When I talk to the millennials who do not trust institutions at all, they love the stress on purpose and authenticity. And they love the idea, they don't trust government. They trust government worse than business. So the idea that engaging in business and doing good, they might be able to make money and they might be able to shift the system, that's like a totally cool idea. And so what makes me most helpful is when I talk to large groups of millennials and they say, you have made me hopeful, you have made me change how I think I'm going to spend my life, we can do this. Because again, they're allies, right? It can't be done without the kinds of shifts that Danielle and others are trying to drive, right? It can't be done without the rediscovery of democracy. It's always been an underdog, right? How do you get under from extraction? I was at a conference and we were talking about the theory of the firm and there were a bunch of economists and we were having a good time. And Sven Beckert, who's in the Department of History, at halfway through said, Rebecca, come on, grow up. The natural state of humanity is extraction. A few creating all the power and all the money. And I said, yes, maybe, but I will not go down without a fight. And that's the fight we're fighting. And so what I'm suggesting is enlisting business allies, because I do believe there's a business case and a place on the other way. And, maybe it will make some help. Is it a done deal? No. Are the barriers very significant? Yes. But at least we can talk about it. At least we can try changing the way in which the business community talks about these issues in public. Because I think many business people would like to shift, feel very uncomfortable with what's going on, but they've been persuaded that this worst kind of predatory capitalism is good business. So we've got to call that out in a rigorous way.
All right, maybe the gentleman in the blue jacket here, and then, did you have your hand up? So, and then we'll take two questions and then you can wrap up, Rebecca. Okay, so after Susan, if you don't mind, when this question is done, we'll bring it up to this gentleman here.
Back and pick up your comment. The difference between doing it.
Can you bring it up, right up near your mouth?
Okay. Does that work?
I think you might have turned it off. No?
I think
No, it's on. It's on. Ignore me. It's great. It's great. Yeah.
It's not such
You just have to hold it close. You have to hold it really.
It's not such a tremendous change. Charles Eliot had to deal with this when he gave the okay to charter the school where you're teaching. They wanted to, some of the business leaders wanted to do some of the kind of thing that you're talking about. He said, I'm not going to allow anybody to teach in the university with the behavior that we have in 1906 and 1907. That worked fine until we got into the 1970s. The change at the school came in the 1970s.
And a little bit later. As you may know, the original mission of the Harvard Business School was to make a decent profit decently.
That's right.
Right.
And it worked very nicely.
And it worked great. It was also the case that the American economy was in a very productive expansionist phase, so one has to be a little careful.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's change that was unplanned and built around the notion of people thinking that if they deregulated everything, they were going to have a free market.
Right.
And that's where the trash came from.
So it's really interesting, the whole intellectual history here. So firstly, I agree with you enormously that understanding that it was different and could be different, and may I say is different. If you go to Germany or Japan, the firms understand their role in a very different way, and there's no evidence they make less profits than their American rivals. So one of the things that we try and do in the course, and a critical part of the argument, is the idea that yes, it can be different and the world didn't come to an end, and in fact, social welfare might have been greatly enhanced. The question of what introduced the shareholder value maximization revolution and whether it's gone, I mean, clearly it's gone too far. Initially, I read it as a response to the Soviet Union, and that people like Hayek and Friedman were really reacting against central planning. But we can argue about this offline.
We're going to take one last question up here in the front.
Yeah.
As we know, some firms are cheaters, and eventually it's a slippery slope. Everybody sees, oh, they're making the short term, that is, the long term. To some people, in the long term, we're all dead, sort of thing. So, and everyone starts joining them. So, what type of role do you see for the government? You said millennials don't trust government, or government can lead to crony capitalism. But if everybody isn't going to be voluntarily doing this, you have to have some sort of mechanism, some sort of standards that encourages and nudges firms to go in that direction. So is there a role for the government?
I absolutely think there is. And as I was trying to lay out that three-part theory of change, where the first part was you do it yourself, and the second part is you do it with your friends. The third part was you realize that doing it with your friends isn't stable. You need to enlist some kind of regulatory authority. So a key part of this agenda is to try and rediscover the power and importance of government. To have the students and the business people rediscover for themselves that the idea of a freestanding market is crazy. It doesn't work. It drives us all to behave in these very destructive ways. And so that's part of my goal here, is to try and change that part of the conversation. I should say, I'm using me and mine. There's a big community. Not only at the business school, but many other schools and many other departments of economics. I think there's a widespread recognition that our current approach to these issues is not working very well. And lots of people experimenting with alternative approaches, including Ninha and Joshua and other colleagues that I see here, but other colleagues all over. So it's a real shift. And that's what makes me cheerful. Right? We'll make this happen.
The world over realizes that governments don't realize it.
Yes, so the question of what happens when you go to the local government and they're busy on the take and doing yes, okay. One problem at a time, but absolutely, that's a huge issue.
Well, please join me in thanking Professor Henderson.